The alarm did not build slowly, it hit all at once, a shriek that bounced off metal walls and made every head in the line turn toward me. I was standing under the scanning arch at the threshold gate on Vashtir Station, waiting for a routine stamp on my travel papers, when the lights above me snapped from calm blue to burning amber. 4 security drones dropped from hidden slots in the ceiling before I could even blink. Their weapons locked onto my chest, with a sound like teeth clicking together. I did not move. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a very old and very useful piece of advice repeated itself. Do not move when weapons are pointed at you. Do not give anyone a reason. The officer behind the desk was a Threll, a slim alien with a hard shell along her arms and thin antennae that trembled above her head. Her name tag read Vexa Orin. She had been bored a few seconds earlier, stamping travel documents without even looking up. Now her antennae were flat against her skull, and her hand hovered near a red switch on her console, like she was not sure whether to press it or run. "Do not move," she said, though I already wasn't. Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. The scanning arch spoke next, and its voice was not like hers. It was flat, mechanical, layered with 3 different languages stacked on top of each other before switching fully into words I could understand. Anomalous scar tissue detected. Biosignature pattern matches Class 1 Divinity Contact Event. Query. Subject. Have you faced a god and lived to tell it? For a moment, nobody in that terminal breathed. Behind me, the line of travelers that had stretched halfway across the hall went completely silent. Somewhere further back, someone dropped a bag, and the sound of it hitting the floor seemed impossibly loud. I felt the eyes on me before I saw them. A pair of Yanari traders near the security desk had gone rigid, their long fingers frozen mid-gesture. A cargo pilot in a stained jumpsuit had backed away so fast he knocked into the person behind him. Even the drones, which a second ago had been locked hard onto my chest, seemed to hesitate, their tiny red targeting lights flickering like they weren't sure what they were looking at anymore. "Sir," Vexa said, and her voice had dropped to something quieter, something careful. "Please confirm your identity and remain still. This is not a normal flag." "I know," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Believe me, I know." I glanced down at my own hands, at the pale lines that ran across my knuckles and up under my sleeves, scars I had stopped thinking about months ago because they had simply become part of my skin, the same way a scratch on an old table stops being something you notice. But right now, under these lights, with this arch calling them by a name I had never heard before, they did not feel like old scars anymore. They felt like something that had just woken up. Vexa tapped at her console, and a soft chime confirmed something on her side. Her antennae twitched again, faster this time. "Divinity contact," she repeated, mostly to herself. I did not think that classification was still active. I thought it was archived. "What does that mean?" I asked, keeping my hands visible, keeping my voice level even though my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. She did not answer right away. Instead, she reached under her desk and pressed something, and a moment later heavy boots echoed against the floor behind me. I turned my head just enough to see a massive figure approaching, easily 2 heads taller than me, built like the walls of the station itself, with thick gray skin and a face that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. A Korvath. I had seen a few of them on the trade routes before, but never this close, and never walking toward me with his hand resting on a weapon at his hip. His name tag read Grath Dorn, Security Captain. He did not shout orders. He did not need to. Everyone in that terminal moved out of his way the instant he stepped forward, the crowd parting like water around a stone. "Stand down," he said to the drones, and though his voice was low, it carried across the entire hall. The little red lights on the drones blinked once and dimmed, though they did not retreat. He stopped a few feet from me and studied my face, then my hands, then the scanning arch's readout still glowing on the screen behind Vexa's desk. For a long moment he said nothing at all. I had the strange feeling that he was not looking at a stranger causing trouble at a checkpoint. He was looking at a photograph he had seen once in a report and never expected to see standing in front of him. "Where did you get those?" he finally said, nodding toward my arms. I opened my mouth to answer, but the scanning arch spoke again first, louder this time, its message now scrolling across every public screen in the terminal, in dozens of languages at once. Compliance required. Subject flagged under Coalition Existential Threat Protocol 7. Divinity contact survivors must register before proceeding. Survivors, plural. As if I was not the only one. As if this had happened before, and somewhere in a database buried deep inside this station, there was a list, and my name had just been added to it. Grath's eyes narrowed, but not with suspicion, with something closer to recognition, and beneath that, something I would only understand a few minutes later. Something like fear, carefully controlled. "You need to answer the question," he said quietly. "Not for the drones, for yourself. Have you faced a god and lived?" The word God should have sounded strange coming from someone who was not even human, someone whose species had never heard of Earth religions or old stories about beings in the sky. But the way he said it did not sound like myth. It sounded like a category, a classification, something his people had a name for because they had needed one, more than once, and every time before, it had ended badly. I thought about lying. For one brief second, I actually considered saying no, that this was some kind of scanning error, that I had gotten these scars in an accident, a fire, anything simple and believable and human. But then I remembered how the Arch had reacted, how fast the drones had dropped, how pale Vexa's face had gone. Whatever this scan was built to detect, it did not make mistakes. It had been built by people who had lost far too much to ever risk a false positive. "Yes," I said. The word left my mouth, and the entire terminal seemed to lean in closer, even though nobody moved. Somewhere behind me, I heard a soft thud, like knees hitting the floor. I turned slightly and saw one of the Yanari traders kneeling, head bowed, one hand pressed flat against his chest, in a gesture I did not recognize yet, but would come to understand very soon. "Explain," Grath said. It was not a request, it was an order, but a gentle one, like a man asking a question he already dreaded the answer to. I looked at Vexa, whose hand was still hovering near that red switch, though she had not pressed it. I looked at the drones, still hanging in the air, weapons lowered now but not stowed. I looked at the growing crowd behind the security barrier, dozens of aliens from species I could not even name, all watching me with the kind of stillness usually reserved for funerals. And I realized something in that moment that would follow me through everything that came after. Whatever I said next was not just going to get me through a checkpoint, it was going to change how every person in this room, and probably every person on this station, looked at me for the rest of my life. 3 years ago, I began, and my voice shook slightly on the first word before steadying. I was part of the crew on a colony ship called the Solace. We were headed for a new settlement site. Nothing unusual, just another long haul through empty space. Then something knocked us out of faster-than-light travel near a binary star system that wasn't even on our charts. Vexa's fingers had stopped moving over her console. She was listening now, fully, the same way everyone else was. "We drifted for hours before we found a moon we could set down on," I continued. "It looked dead, no atmosphere worth mentioning, no signs of life on any scan we ran, but there was a structure on the surface, something enormous, built from material none of our instruments could identify. We thought it was ruins, something abandoned a long, long time ago." "It was not abandoned," Grath said quietly. "It was not a question." "No," I said, "it was not." The arch above me pulsed once, a soft green light this time instead of the harsh amber from before, as if it too was waiting for the rest of the story. Vexa had gone completely still, her earlier fear replaced by something closer to horrified fascination. Even the drones, hovering silently overhead, seemed to have adjusted their sensors toward me, recording every word. "The moment our landing team got close enough," I said, "the structure woke up." Lights we hadn't seen before started running along its surface in patterns that looked almost like veins, and then something came out of it. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't any kind of creature I had ever heard described, not in any story, not in any report from any species we had met before that day. It didn't walk. It didn't fly. It was just suddenly there, closer each time I blinked, like distance meant nothing to it. Grath's jaw tightened. Behind him, I noticed more security personnel had gathered, standing at a respectful distance, listening rather than approaching. Whatever protocol usually applied to a checkpoint disturbance, none of them seemed to be following it anymore. "What happened to your crew?" he asked, and for the first time, his enormous frame seemed to brace itself, as if he already expected the answer and hated that he had to hear it out loud. I felt my throat tighten. Even now, months later, standing in a bright and crowded terminal filled with strangers, that question dragged me straight back to the freezing dark of that landing site, to the sound of my crewmates calling out to each other, and then, one by one, not calling out anymore. "Some of them didn't survive first contact," I said carefully, choosing each word like it might break something if I got it wrong. "It wasn't violence, not the way you would picture a fight. It was something closer to erasure. One moment someone was standing beside me, and the next moment there was simply less of the world than there had been a second before." A ripple went through the crowd behind the barrier, murmurs in half a dozen languages that the translation devices around the terminal converted into an overlapping wave of the same reaction, over and over. Impossible, unbelievable, and underneath all of it, quieter, more urgent, the word that mattered most: confirmed. Vexa finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our records list 11 prior confirmed encounters, with entities matching that classification across the last 400 years of Coalition history. Do you understand what happened in every one of those 11 cases?" I shook my head slowly, though I had already started to guess. "None of them survived," she said. "Not one. Full crews, in some cases entire settlements, gone within hours of contact. The protocol you triggered exists because Divinity Contact has never, in recorded Coalition history, produced a single living witness. Until this scan, 3 minutes ago." The weight of that sentence settled over the terminal like a physical thing. I understood now why the drones had dropped so fast, why Vexa's hands had been shaking, why Grath Dorn, a man built like a small mountain, was looking at me the way you might look at something that should not exist and yet clearly did. I was not a suspect anymore. I was not even really a traveler waiting for a stamp on my documents. I was, according to every scrap of information this station had on file, something that had never happened before. "There's more to it," I said quietly, because I could feel the question forming behind Grath's eyes before he even asked it. Everyone wanted to know how. Not just that I had lived, but why. What had made me different from 11 crews and however many people, across 400 years, who had faced the same thing and simply ceased to be. "Then you will tell us," Grath said, his voice low and steady, though I caught the faintest tremor underneath it, the sound of a man who had spent his whole career keeping people calm during disasters, and had just realized this particular disaster did not come with a manual, all of it. Because if there is even the smallest chance that thing is still out there, we need to understand exactly what happened on that moon. I looked past him, at the crowd still watching in complete silence, at the kneeling trader whose head remained bowed, at Vexa's pale face and the flickering readout still glowing above her desk with words no Coalition system had ever needed to display before. "Divinity Contact Survivor. Status. Confirmed." I took a slow breath, steadying myself the way I had learned to do standing on that cold, dead moon 3 years ago, right before everything in my life split into a before and an after. "All right," I said. "I'll tell you everything, but you should probably sit down for this. What happened out there wasn't just about survival. It changed the way I understand everything, including what that thing actually wanted from us in the end." Nobody sat down. Nobody moved at all. But every single person in that terminal, human and alien alike, leaned in just a little closer, waiting for me to keep going, because whatever I said next was about to rewrite everything the Coalition thought it knew about facing something it had always assumed could not be survived. I did not start the story from the beginning. Not really, because there was no way to explain the ending without dragging everyone through the moon itself, step by step, the way I had lived it. So I began where it mattered most, at the moment our ship stopped being a ship and became a coffin waiting to happen. The Solace had been 3 weeks into the crossing when the drop happened. 1 second we were gliding through faster-than-light space, smooth and quiet the way a good crossing should feel, and the next second, every alarm on the bridge went off together, a wall of sound that made my ears ring even through the recycled air of the corridor where I was walking at the time. The ship shuddered so hard I was thrown against a bulkhead, and I remember tasting blood before I even understood what had happened. We had been pulled out of faster-than-light travel by something, not a malfunction, not a collision. Something had reached into the fabric of the crossing itself and yanked us back into normal space, like a hand closing around a fish in a stream. Captain Owen Blake got everyone to their stations within minutes, his voice steady over the intercom, even though I could hear the strain underneath it. He had commanded transport vessels for over a decade, and in all that time, according to what he told us later, he had never heard of anything capable of forcing a ship out of faster-than-light travel without so much as a warning flicker on the sensors. We drifted for hours, running diagnostics, trying to understand what had happened. The stars outside the viewport were wrong, unfamiliar patterns that did not match any of our charts. We had been thrown somewhere none of our navigation systems recognized, deep inside a binary star system that existed in no Coalition database, no old exploration record, nothing. It was Grace Sutton, our chief engineer, who found the moon. She had been running long-range scans looking for anywhere we might set down safely, somewhere with enough gravity and enough shelter to let us make repairs before attempting another crossing. The moon orbited the smaller of the 2 stars, gray and cratered and utterly still, the kind of place that looked like it had been dead since before either star had finished forming. "No atmosphere worth mentioning," Grace reported, her voice carrying that particular calm she always used when she was actually worried. "But there's something on the surface. Large structure, metallic signature, though it doesn't match anything in our materials database. Could be old. Could be very old." Captain Blake made the call to set down near it. We needed somewhere to repair the crossing drive, and the structure at least suggested the moon had been visited before, which meant it might have resources we could use. Looking back now, I understand that decision the way you understand a lot of things after everything has already happened, which is to say, too late to matter, but clear as glass all the same. We landed a few hours later. I was part of the away team, along with Grace, along with a quiet young systems technician named Liam Turner, who had barely said 100 words to me the entire crossing, but who I had grown to like anyway. The way you grow to like people you are stuck with for weeks, in tight metal corridors. There was also Nora Hale, our medic, sharp-eyed and quick with a joke, even when things were tense. The kind of person who made a ship full of strangers feel a little more like a crew. The 4 of us suited up and stepped out onto gray dust that had not been disturbed in what felt like forever. Our boots left the only footprints for what looked like miles in every direction. The structure rose ahead of us, easily the size of a small mountain range, its surface smooth and dark, catching the thin light from the distant star and throwing it back in strange colors that did not seem to belong to any metal I had ever seen. "It's beautiful," Nora said over the comm, and I remember agreeing with her, because it was. Even now, knowing everything I know, I cannot pretend that first sight of it was anything other than beautiful. That was part of what made everything after feel so wrong. Something that terrible should not have been allowed to look like that. We approached slowly, running scans every few steps, cautious the way any trained crew would be cautious around something unknown. Grace found what looked like an entrance, a seam in the structure's surface large enough for a person to walk through standing upright. There were no markings, no writing, nothing that suggested language the way we understood it. Just smooth, dark material and that strange shifting light. "Captain," Grace said into her comm, "we've found what might be an entry point, requesting permission to proceed with caution." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that meant Captain Blake was weighing the decision carefully back on the ship. When his voice came through, it was steady but firm. "Proceed slowly. Scan everything. If anything feels wrong, you pull back immediately. That's an order, not a suggestion." We should have listened harder to that word. Wrong. We should have paid more attention to the way the hair on my arms had already started standing up inside my suit, the way Nora had gone quiet, in a manner that did not match her usual easy chatter, the way Liam kept glancing over his shoulder at nothing at all, as if some part of him already sensed what the rest of us hadn't figured out yet. We stepped through the entrance together. Inside, the structure was even stranger than the surface had suggested. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, a rhythm too slow and too deliberate to be anything mechanical, more like breathing than machinery. Light came from no visible source, filling the space with a dim glow that made shadows stretch and shrink in ways that did not match our movements. "This isn't architecture," Grace whispered, running her scanner along the nearest wall. "I don't know what this is, but it isn't architecture the way we understand it." We walked deeper, following a corridor that curved gently downward, deeper into the structure than our landing point had suggested was possible from the outside. The pulsing in the walls grew stronger, more insistent, until I could feel it faintly through the soles of my boots, a rhythm that seemed to match, or maybe influence, the beating of my own heart. Then the lights changed. It happened all at once, the dim glow along the walls, brightening into thin lines that spread outward like veins beneath skin, tracing patterns across every surface around us. The pulsing sound grew louder, filling our helmets even through the sealed suits, and Nora grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, though I did not feel it until much later. "Something's happening," Liam said, his voice tight with the effort of staying calm. "Grace, what is this?" Grace did not answer. She was staring past all of us, down the corridor ahead, where the light had begun to gather into something denser, something with shape, though no shape I could have described in that first moment, beyond simply saying that space itself seemed to be bending around a single point, folding inward like fabric, being pulled by an invisible thread. And then it was there. I want to be honest about this part, because so many people afterward tried to get me to describe it in ways that made sense, ways that fit into stories they already knew, monsters from old films, gods from old books, machines from old nightmares. But none of that fits. What stood in that corridor, or hovered, or simply existed in that corridor, was not shaped like anything. It had presence more than form, the way a very loud sound has presence even before you understand what is making it. Looking at it made my eyes water, not from brightness, but from the effort of trying to process something that did not want to be processed. "Do not move," Grace said, so quietly I almost missed it, though there was no real need for the warning. None of us could have moved even if we had wanted to. My legs had simply stopped answering to whatever part of my brain usually told them what to do. The presence drifted closer, and as it moved, I felt something press against my mind, not painful exactly, but invasive, in a way that made my thoughts feel exposed, like a room with the walls suddenly torn away. I had the distinct sensation of being read, the way you might skim through a book, flipping pages faster than any human eye could follow, searching for something specific among all the noise. Nora made a small sound beside me, something between a gasp and a sob, and I turned my head just enough to see her eyes had gone wide and glassy, fixed on the presence with an expression of pure, undiluted terror that I had never seen on another human face before that moment. "It's looking at us," she whispered. "It's looking right through us." The presence stopped a short distance away, and for a long, stretched moment, nothing happened at all. The pulsing in the walls slowed, almost as if the entire structure was holding its breath along with us. I remember thinking absurdly that this might be it, that this might be the moment everything ended, and being surprised at how calm that thought felt, compared to the fear pressing against every other part of me. Then Liam took a step back, Just a small one, an instinctive flinch rather than a decision, and the presence reacted instantly. The corridor filled with a sound I still cannot fully describe, something between a note played on an instrument no human has ever built and a word spoken in a language that predates language itself. And where Liam had been standing, there was simply less of the world than there had been a heartbeat before. Not blood, not violence in any way I could point to and say, "There, that is what happened to him." Just absence, sudden and complete, as if a hand had reached out and erased a single sentence from a very long book. Nora screamed. I do not think I have ever heard a sound like that before or since, raw in a way that went straight through the suit's speakers and into my bones. Grace grabbed her, pulling her backward, shouting something into the comm that I could not process fast enough to understand, because my entire mind had narrowed down to a single, screaming thought. Run. But there was nowhere to run. The presence filled the corridor ahead of us, and behind us, the entrance we had come through seemed impossibly far away, the walls stretching longer with every desperate step we tried to take. "Captain," Grace was shouting into the comm, her voice cracking under the strain. "Captain, we need immediate evacuation. We need it now. Liam is gone. I repeat, Liam is gone." There was no response. Static filled the channel where Captain Blake's steady voice should have been, and in that silence I understood something that made the fear inside me sharpen into something colder and clearer. Whatever this thing was, it was not just capable of erasing a person. It might already be doing something to the ship itself, to everyone still waiting up there for us to come home. The presence moved again, closer this time, and I felt that invasive pressure against my mind return, stronger now, more focused, as if it had finished skimming and had settled on a single page it wanted to read more carefully. And somehow, without any doubt at all, I understood that the page it had settled on was me. Nora and Grace were still moving, still trying to pull each other back toward the entrance, still shouting into comms that offered nothing but static in return. But I had stopped moving entirely, caught in that pressure, in that reading, feeling every part of myself laid open in a way no scanner, no medical exam, nothing in my entire life had ever come close to matching. And somewhere underneath the terror, underneath the certainty that I was about to disappear the same way Liam had disappeared, a small and stubborn part of me refused to simply stand there and let it happen without at least trying to understand what it wanted. So I did the only thing that made any sense in that impossible moment. I looked back at it, not away, not down, not closed my eyes and waited for the end, the way every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do. I looked directly at the presence filling that corridor, and somewhere in the wordless pressure moving through my mind, I felt something shift, just slightly, like a held breath finally being noticed. For the first time since it had appeared, the thing that had already erased one of my crewmates seemed to pause. That pause lasted less than a second, but it felt like an entire lifetime folded into a single held breath. I stood there in the pulsing light of that corridor, staring at something my mind still refused to fully render into any shape I could describe later, and I understood, without knowing how I understood it, that looking away would have been the last thing I ever did. Grace grabbed my shoulder from behind, hard enough that I felt it even through the suit. "Move," she hissed, her voice shredded with fear, but somehow still holding on to command instinct even now. "Whatever you are doing, we are not staying here." I did not move. I could not explain it to her then, and I am not sure I can fully explain it now. But some part of me understood that turning away from that presence in that exact moment would break whatever fragile thread had just formed between us. So I stayed where I was, and I kept looking at it, even as every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. The presence drifted a fraction closer, and this time the pressure against my mind changed. It was still invasive, still overwhelming, but it no longer felt like something skimming pages at random. It felt deliberate now, focused, the way a person might slow down while reading a paragraph they found unexpectedly interesting. Nora had gone quiet beside Grace, her breathing ragged over the comm, her eyes fixed on the space where Liam had been standing only moments before. I could hear her whispering his name over and over, a small broken sound that cut through the silence of that ancient structure like a blade. "It's not attacking him," Grace said suddenly, and I realized she meant me. "Look at it, it stopped." She was right. Whatever this presence was, it had erased Liam without hesitation, without any pause at all between the moment he flinched and the moment he simply ceased to exist. But with me, something different was happening. It had paused. It was still here, still pressing against my mind, but it had not done to me what it had done to him. I do not know exactly what gave me the courage, or maybe the stupidity, to speak next, but I did it anyway, because the silence had become unbearable, and because some instinct told me that silence might be exactly the wrong response to whatever question this thing was asking without words. "I don't know what you are," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to steady it, "but you already took one of us. Please, just let the rest of my crew go." The pressure against my mind sharpened at the sound of my voice, and for a terrifying second I thought I had made a mistake, that speaking had been the wrong choice, that I had just invited the same fate that had claimed Liam only moments before. But instead, something extraordinary happened. The pulsing light along the walls slowed even further, and the presence itself seemed to draw back slightly, as if reconsidering. Behind me, the comm crackled to life, and Captain Blake's voice broke through the static, tight with barely controlled panic. "Away, team, respond. We are reading massive energy fluctuations from your position. Grace, talk to me. What is happening down there?" Grace opened her mouth to answer, but before she could get a single word out, the ship shuddered violently around all of us. Or rather, the ground beneath our boots shuddered, transmitting the tremor from somewhere far above where the Solace sat waiting in orbit. Through the comm, I heard alarms blaring on the bridge, and beneath them, a new voice, one of the bridge officers, shouting something about the ship's reactor readings spiking without explanation. "It's reaching the ship," Nora said, horror creeping into her voice, as she finally found words again. "Whatever this thing is, it isn't just here with us. It's already up there too." I felt the presence's attention shift, just slightly, as though it had heard her words and was now considering the ship in orbit the same way it had considered the four of us walking through its corridor. And in that moment, I understood something crucial, something that would shape every decision I made for the rest of that day and every day after it. This thing did not experience space or distance the way we did. It was not confined to this structure, or even to this moon. It could reach as far as it wanted to reach, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. Not with weapons, not with technology, not with anything our species had ever built. The only thing that seemed to matter to it, at least in that moment, was the strange and unexpected fact that I was still standing here, still looking at it, still speaking, when every previous encounter recorded across 400 years of Coalition history had apparently ended the same way within seconds. "Grace," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, "get Nora out of here. Head back toward the entrance. I don't think it's finished with me yet, but I don't think it wants the rest of you." "I am not leaving you here alone," Grace snapped, and even through the terror in her voice, I could hear the stubborn loyalty that had kept our crew functioning through 3 weeks of a difficult crossing. "If it wanted all of us gone, we would already be gone. It's doing something else. I don't understand it yet, but I think if you stay, you're just giving it more reasons to decide none of us should be here." It was a guess. It was, if I am honest, barely more than a desperate hope dressed up as logic, but something about it must have carried enough conviction, because Grace hesitated only a moment longer before grabbing Nora's arm and beginning to pull her back toward the distant entrance, the corridor no longer stretching impossibly far the way it had seemed to only minutes before. I turned back to face the presence alone, and for the first time since it had appeared, I felt truly, completely afraid, not of dying exactly, but of failing to understand something that felt enormously important, something that might determine whether anyone on the Solace survived what was happening to their reactor at that very moment. "What do you want?" I asked, and this time my voice did not shake at all, because somewhere underneath the fear, Something else had taken root, something that felt almost like anger. You've already taken someone from us. If you're going to take more, at least tell me why. The pressure in my mind shifted again, and this time it was not simply reading, not simply skimming. It felt like a conversation trying to form itself out of raw sensation, images and impressions flooding through my thoughts faster than I could consciously process them. I saw, or felt, or somehow experienced glimpses of other encounters, other ships, other crews standing in corridors just like this one, in structures scattered across systems I had never heard of, each encounter ending the same way, over and over, an endless repetition stretching back further than I could comprehend. Every single one of them had ended in erasure. Every single crew had reacted the same way, fleeing, screaming, breaking apart the moment the presence made itself known. Every single time, within seconds, there had been nothing left to observe, until now. I understood, in a flash of comprehension that felt like ice water down my spine, that this presence had been alone with that pattern for longer than I could imagine, watching species after species arrive and vanish in the same predictable, tragic rhythm, and that somewhere along the way, the pattern itself had become the only thing it knew to expect. It was not malicious in the way a person could be malicious. It simply did not know any other outcome was possible. And I had just broken the pattern by refusing to run. "You didn't expect this," I said slowly, testing the thought even as it formed. "You didn't expect anyone to still be standing here." The pressure in my mind pulsed once, sharp and sudden, and I took that as something close to confirmation, though I had no way to be certain. Above me, through the comm still connected to the ship, I could hear the alarms growing louder, more frantic, and beneath them, a voice I recognized as the ship's chief officer, shouting something about containment failing on the reactor. Whatever this presence was doing to the Solace, it was running out of time, and I understood with sudden clarity that if I did not find some way to reach it, to truly reach it, in the next few moments, there might not be a ship left to return to at all. "Listen to me," I said, my voice rising with an urgency I could not fully control anymore. "You can read my mind, or whatever it is you're doing, then you already know I'm telling the truth. My crew came here because we were lost, not because we meant you or this place any harm. If you destroy that ship, you won't be answering any question. You'll just be repeating the same pattern you've apparently been watching for longer than I can even imagine." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The pressure in my mind remained, steady and unreadable, and somewhere far above, the alarms continued their frantic wail. I thought, with a strange and sudden calm, that this might genuinely be the end, that I had said everything I had to say, and there was nothing left to do but wait, and see what this ancient, incomprehensible thing decided to do with the information. Then, all at once, the alarms through the comm went silent. Not cut off, not destroyed, simply silent, the way a room goes quiet when an argument suddenly ends. A few seconds later, the ship's chief officer's voice came through again, shaky but coherent, reporting that the reactor readings had stabilized on their own, that whatever had been causing the fluctuation had simply stopped. Relief crashed through me so hard my knees nearly buckled, but I forced myself to stay upright, to stay focused, because the presence was still there, still filling the corridor ahead of me with that impossible, formless weight. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it more completely than I had ever meant those two words in my entire life. The presence did not respond in words, of course, because it had no voice in any sense I could understand. But the pressure in my mind shifted one final time, softer now, almost curious, in a way that felt entirely different from the cold, assessing pressure of before. I had the distinct and strange sensation of being studied the way you might study something unexpected and interesting, rather than something threatening. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to withdraw. The light along the walls dimmed back down to its original soft glow, the pulsing slowed to something almost peaceful, and the corridor itself seemed to exhale, tension draining out of the very structure around me. I stood there alone for a long moment after it had gone, staring at the empty space where it had been, my legs finally giving out beneath me as the adrenaline that had kept me standing drained away all at once. I sat there on the cold floor of that ancient structure, shaking, staring at my own hands, and it was only then that I noticed the thin, pale lines beginning to appear across my skin, tracing paths up my arms and across my chest, exactly where the scars would remain for the rest of my life. Grace found me a few minutes later, having convinced Nora to wait just inside the entrance while she came back for me. She helped me to my feet without a single word, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and disbelief that I imagine matched my own expression perfectly. Neither of us spoke as we made our way back through the corridor, back out into the thin light of that distant star, back toward the solace waiting silently above us. It was not until we were safely aboard the ship, until the medbay lights were bright and clinical around me, and Nora was running scan after scan over my new and unexplained scars, with hands that still trembled from what we had all witnessed, that the full weight of what had happened finally settled over me. We had lost Liam. We would carry that loss with us for the rest of our lives, and no explanation, no matter how strange or profound, would ever make that loss feel smaller. But 3 of us had walked back out of that structure alive, when every record, every pattern stretching back centuries, said that should have been impossible. And somewhere deep inside me, underneath the grief and the shock and the exhaustion, a single question had already begun to take root, one that would follow me across every star system I traveled through for the next 3 years, right up until the moment a security scanner on a crowded station asked me to answer it out loud in front of a room full of strangers. Why had it let us go? And more than that, what exactly had it seen in me that made it decide, after 400 years of the same tragic pattern repeating itself without exception, that this particular time, things could be different? When I finished speaking, the terminal at Vashtir Station remained silent for what felt like a very long time. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Even the drones hovering overhead seemed to have stopped their faint mechanical hum, as if the entire room had been holding its breath along with me through every word of that memory. Grath Dorn was the first to break the silence, and his voice, though still low, carried an edge I had not heard from him before, something between disbelief and a kind of desperate need to understand. You spoke to it. You spoke to a Class 1 entity, and it listened. I don't know if listened is the right word, I said honestly. I don't think it experiences anything the way we do, but something changed when I refused to run. Something changed when I asked it a question, instead of just waiting to disappear. Vexa Oren had not moved from her console the entire time I was speaking, her antennae still trembling slightly, though now it seemed to be from something closer to awe than fear. She glanced down at her screen, where the scan results still glowed steadily, confirming everything I had said in ways her instruments could measure, even if they could not explain. "The scars," she said quietly. "They are not injuries, are they?" I looked down at my own arms, at the thin, pale lines that had been part of me for 3 years now, tracing paths across skin that had otherwise healed completely. "No," I said. Nora ran every test she could think of once we were back on the ship. No burns, no radiation, no evidence of trauma at the cellular level. Whatever it did to me, it didn't hurt me, not in any way medicine understands. It just marked me. "Marked you," Grath repeated, and something in his expression shifted, a kind of careful, guarded curiosity, replacing the wariness that had been there since the moment the alarms first sounded. "Marked you as what?" That was, I realized, the exact question I had spent the last 3 years trying to answer for myself, without ever finding anything close to a satisfying explanation. I had turned it over in my mind on countless nights since, lying awake in cramped bunk rooms on cargo ships, staring at my own hands under dim emergency lighting, wondering what exactly I had become in the eyes of something so far beyond human understanding that our entire species barely had language to describe it. "I think," I said slowly, choosing my words with as much care as I could manage, "that it marked me the way you might mark a page in a book you plan on returning to. Not as a trophy, not as a warning to others, just as something worth remembering, something it hadn't expected to find and didn't want to lose track of. A murmur ran through the crowd gathered behind the security barrier, translated across dozens of languages into overlapping waves of the same disbelief. I caught fragments of it drifting toward me, questions in half a dozen tongues, some hushed with fear, others sharpened with something closer to hunger for more detail, as if the story I had just told had cracked open a door that generations of coalition scholars had assumed would remain forever sealed. 400 years, Vexa said, almost to herself, scrolling through data on her console with hands that were no longer shaking quite as badly. 11 documented encounters, thousands of casualties across those encounters combined, and in every single case, the pattern held. Contact resulted in total loss, every time, without exception, until 3 years ago. Why? Grath asked, and this time the question was aimed directly at me, weighted with something that felt almost like desperation beneath its calm delivery. Why you? Out of everyone who has ever faced something like that, out of every crew, every species, why did it choose to let you live? I had asked myself that same question more times than I could count, and I still did not have a complete answer, only pieces of one, fragments I had assembled slowly over 3 years of quiet reflection and the occasional restless night when sleep refused to come. I don't think it was really about me specifically, I said finally. Not at first, anyway. I think what caught its attention was simpler than that. I think it was surprised. Surprised, Grath repeated, his heavy brow furrowing. Every crew before mine ran, I said. Every crew before mine panicked the moment it appeared, and I understand why, because I felt that same panic myself, standing right there in that corridor. But panic was apparently the only response it had ever observed. Fear, followed by loss, followed by silence, over and over, century after century. It had no reason to expect anything different, because nothing different had ever happened before. And you gave it something different, Vexa said softly. I didn't plan to, I admitted. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't brave in the way people probably imagine when they hear a story like this. I was terrified. My legs simply stopped working, and by the time I realized I hadn't run, it had already stopped and started paying attention to me instead. I think, more than anything else, I just happened to break the pattern by accident, and it was curious enough about that accident to pause before finishing what it had already started with Liam. Saying his name out loud in that crowded terminal, in front of strangers who had never known him, never heard his quiet voice or seen the careful way he double-checked every calculation before committing to it, sent a fresh wave of grief through me that I had not expected. 3 years had softened the edges of that loss, but they had not erased it, and speaking of him now, in this strange and public place, reminded me how much of that moon I still carried with me every single day. Grath seemed to notice the shift in my expression, because his voice softened slightly when he spoke again. I am sorry. For your crewmate. Whatever else happened out there, that loss was real, and it deserves to be acknowledged before we ask you anything more. I nodded, grateful for the small kindness in the middle of everything else happening around me. The drones still hovering, the crowd still watching, the weight of an entire station's worth of attention pressing down on me like something physical. There's something else, I said, after a moment, because I could feel the question hovering unasked in the space between us, the one thing everyone in that terminal seemed to want to know more than anything else. You're wondering if it's still out there, if it might come looking for me, or for anyone else. Vexa's antennae stilled completely, and Grath's expression hardened back into something more guarded, more alert, the way it had been when he first approached me at the checkpoint. Is it? He asked simply. I don't know, I said, and I let the honesty of that uncertainty sit in the air between us, because pretending to have an answer I did not actually possess felt far more dangerous than admitting the truth. I haven't heard anything, haven't felt anything, not since we left that system, but I also don't think distance means the same thing to it that it means to us. If it decided it wanted to find me again, I'm not entirely sure a few thousand light years would be enough to stop it. The crowd's murmuring grew louder at that, a ripple of unease spreading outward through the terminal, and I noticed several of the drones adjusting their positions slightly, as if their programming had just recalculated some new category of threat that none of their original protocols had ever accounted for. "Then why are you not afraid?" Grath asked, studying my face carefully, searching for something I was not sure I could give him. "Standing here, telling this story, in front of all these people, you speak of it calmly, too calmly, for someone who watched a crewmate erased in front of him and believes the same thing might still be capable of finding him again." It was a fair question, and I thought about it seriously before answering, because the truth was more complicated than simple bravery or simple resignation, and I wanted to give him something honest rather than something that merely sounded impressive. "I think," I said slowly, "that fear only gets you so far before it stops being useful. I was afraid the entire time I stood in that corridor. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But somewhere in the middle of that fear, I also got angry, and I think that anger mattered just as much as anything else that happened. Not anger at the thing itself, exactly, but anger at the idea that fear was the only option any of us had left. My engineer, back on the ship, tried to reroute the reactor to overload rather than let whatever was happening take another one of us, and she was terrified while she did it. That wasn't calm. That wasn't some kind of practiced bravery. That was just refusing to let fear be the last thing that happened." Grath was quiet for a long moment after that, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Some old memory of his own, perhaps. Some moment in his own long career where fear and defiance had tangled together in exactly the way I was describing. "That is a very human thing to say," he said finally, and I could not quite tell if it was meant as a compliment or simply an observation, though something in his tone suggested it might be both. "Maybe," I said. "I can't speak for every species, only my own. But I've met enough people from enough different worlds since that day to believe it isn't only a human thing. I think most people, most species, given the choice between disappearing quietly or going out while still trying to protect the people around them, would choose the second option, even knowing it might not change the outcome at all." Vexa had been listening closely to every word, and now she spoke again, her voice steadier than it had been since the alarms first sounded. "The protocol requires us to classify your case formally before you can proceed through the gate. But I have reviewed every category listed under Existential Threat Protocol 7, and none of them account for what you have just described. Every prior classification assumes total loss as the only possible outcome." "So what happens now?" I asked, genuinely uncertain, watching her fingers hover over her console, as though she herself did not yet know the answer. "I do not know," she admitted, glancing up at Grath as though seeking guidance he did not seem entirely prepared to give either. "I have never had to classify an outcome that does not already exist in our records. I believe this station may need to create an entirely new category, and I suspect that decision will need to come from somewhere far above my authority." Grath nodded slowly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the crowd still gathered behind the barrier, taking in the mixture of awe and fear, still visible on so many different faces, from so many different worlds. "Then we will need to contact Coalition Central. This is no longer simply a checkpoint matter. If what you have described is accurate, it changes something fundamental about what we believed possible when facing an encounter like this." I felt a fresh wave of exhaustion settle over me, the kind that came not from physical exertion, but from the sheer emotional weight of having relived that day on the moon, in front of a room full of strangers, of having spoken Liam's name aloud for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, of having finally put into words a story I had carried silently for 3 long years. "Before you contact anyone," I said, and something in my own voice surprised me, a steadiness I had not expected to find after everything I had just relived. "There is one more thing you should probably know. Something I haven't said yet, because I only really understood it myself much later, long after we had already left that system behind." Grath's attention sharpened immediately, and even Vexa leaned forward slightly over her console, waiting. "I don't think it was finished with me," I said quietly. "I think whatever happened on that moon was only the beginning of something, not the end. And if that's true, then this scan today, this alarm, this entire conversation we're having right now, might just be the first sign that it's starting to pay attention again." The silence that followed that statement felt heavier than any silence before it, thick with a kind of dread that seemed to settle over every single person in that crowded terminal at once. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, I heard someone whisper a question in a language I did not recognize, though the fear behind it needed no translation at all. Grath Dorn did not answer me right away. He turned instead toward the security desk, speaking in low, rapid tones to Vexa and to the other officers who had gathered around during the last few minutes of my story. I caught only fragments of what he said, words like escort, quarantine wing, and coalition central, each one landing somewhere in my chest like a small, cold stone. "You are not under arrest," Vexa said quickly, catching the look on my face as the officers began to move around me with a new sense of purpose. "Please understand that. But given what you have just told us, we cannot simply let you continue through this gate as though nothing unusual has happened. There are protocols that exist even for situations our records never expected to encounter." "I understand," I said, and I did, even though a small, tired part of me had hoped that telling the truth might somehow make things simpler rather than more complicated. Of course it would not. Nothing about that day on the moon had ever been simple, and there was no reason to expect that pattern to change now. They led me toward a quieter section of the terminal, away from the main crowd, though I could still feel eyes following me the entire way, whispers trailing behind like a wake behind a ship. The Yanari trader who had knelt earlier was still watching from a distance, his expression unreadable, though something in the way he held himself suggested he had not moved from that spot the entire time I had been speaking. Inside a smaller, dimly lit room off the main terminal, Grath sat across from me at a plain metal table, while Vexa remained near the door, her console tucked under one arm, still recording everything for whatever report would need to be filed once this was over. "I have contacted Coalition Central," Grath said, his voice heavy with the weight of what that meant. "They are aware of the scan results. They are aware of your account. A senior classification officer will be arriving within the hour to determine how to proceed." "And until then?" I asked. "Until then, you remain here, under observation, though not confinement," he said. "I want to be clear about that distinction. Nobody here believes you are a danger in the way the drones initially suggested. But an event like this has never been recorded before, not in 400 years. And the people responsible for protecting this station, this entire sector, need time to understand exactly what that means." I nodded slowly, too tired to argue even if I had wanted to, and for a while, the three of us simply sat in that quiet room, the noise of the terminal outside muffled, but still audible, a steady hum of a station that had no idea how close it might be standing to something far larger than any of them had ever imagined. It was Vexa who finally broke the silence, her voice softer now than it had been at any point since the alarms first sounded. "May I ask you something? Off the record?" "Of course," I said. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Going out there, landing on that moon. If you could go back, knowing everything you know now, would you make the same choice?" It was a question I had asked myself many times over the last 3 years, usually late at night, usually when sleep refused to come and the memory of Liam's absence pressed heaviest against my chest. I thought about it seriously now, giving her question the honesty it deserved rather than the easy answer that might have made everyone in that room feel more comfortable. "I don't know if regret is the right word," I said finally. "I lost someone I cared about that day. I carry that with me every single day, and I don't think that weight ever really goes away. Not completely. But I also learned something out there that I don't think I could have learned anywhere else, something about what happens when fear meets its limit and something else has to take over instead. I'm not sure I would call that a gift, but I don't think I would call it a mistake either." Vexa was quiet for a long moment, considering that answer, before nodding slowly, as though it matched something she had already suspected but had needed to hear confirmed. The door opened before any of us could say more, and a new figure stepped into the room, tall and thin, wrapped in formal robes that marked her immediately as someone of considerable rank within the Coalition's administrative structure. Her species was unfamiliar to me, pale-skinned with large, dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room in a single sweeping glance, myself included. "I am Classification Officer Ilyana Sef," she said, her voice measured and precise, carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of practice rather than simple confidence. "I have reviewed the initial report transmitted from this station. I would like to hear the account directly, if you are willing to share it once more." I was exhausted, my throat raw from talking, my mind still tangled in memories I had not fully unpacked in years, but I understood the importance of what she was asking, and so I told the story again, from the beginning, watching her expression remain carefully neutral through every part of it, the dropout of faster-than-light travel, the structure on the moon, the presence in the corridor, Liam's absence, the reactor stabilizing, the long silence afterward as the presence withdrew. When I finished, Ilyana Sef remained silent for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on some point just past my shoulder, as though she were consulting some internal record only she had access to. "In 400 years of documented history," she said finally, "the Coalition has recorded 11 Class 1 Divinity contact events. Every single one resulted in total loss, without exception. Our entire framework for understanding these entities, every protocol, every classification, every recommended response, was built upon the assumption that survival was simply not a possible outcome." "I understand that," I said quietly. "You do not fully understand it," she said, not unkindly, but with the weight of someone correcting a misunderstanding they considered important. "That assumption shaped policy across dozens of member worlds. Entire fleets have been ordered to avoid systems flagged with even the faintest possibility of similar structures, based entirely on the certainty that contact meant death, always, without variation. Your account, if verified, does not simply add a footnote to our records. It challenges the foundation those records were built upon." I had not fully considered the scale of what my survival might mean beyond my own small, personal story, and hearing it laid out so plainly by someone with the authority to understand its full implications sent a fresh chill through me. "What happens now?" I asked, echoing the same question I had asked Grath earlier, though this time I understood the answer might carry far greater consequences than a simple checkpoint delay. "Your account will be formally recorded and cross-referenced against the physical evidence of your scars," Ilyana said. "A new classification will be created, separate from the previous 11 cases, reflecting an outcome our records have never before needed to describe. You will likely be asked to speak with researchers who study these entities, though that request will come through proper channels, and you retain the right to decline participation beyond what is required for today's report." "And if it comes back?" I asked, the question that had been sitting heaviest in my chest since I first spoke it aloud in the main terminal. "If whatever happened out there isn't finished, if it decides to pay attention again, what happens then?" Ilyana's expression shifted slightly, the first real crack in her composed exterior since she had entered the room. "Then we will be facing something this coalition has never faced before, an entity with prior contact, and apparently at least some degree of restraint. I will not pretend to know what that might mean. Nobody currently alive has any experience to draw from." The room fell silent again, the weight of that uncertainty settling over all four of us. Outside, through the thin walls, I could still hear the distant hum of the terminal, travelers moving through their ordinary days, most of them completely unaware of the conversation happening in this small room, unaware of how close their entire understanding of the universe had just come to being rewritten. Grath finally spoke, his deep voice cutting gently through the silence. "For what it is worth," he said, looking directly at me, "I do not believe you should carry the weight of what happened out there alone. Not the loss, and not whatever uncertainty comes next. Whatever this station decides, whatever Coalition Central ultimately determines, you did something none of us believed was possible. That deserves to be acknowledged, even amid everything else. I felt something loosen slightly in my chest at his words, a small measure of relief after the exhausting weight of the last hour, though the underlying uncertainty of everything still ahead of me remained firmly in place. Ilyana rose from her seat, gathering the small device she had been using to record our conversation. You will remain on this station for the time being, under standard observation rather than confinement, as Captain Dorn indicated earlier. Formal proceedings regarding your classification will take some time. I would recommend patience, though I understand that may be difficult given everything you have already endured. As she moved toward the door, she paused, glancing back at me with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between professional curiosity and something more personal, harder to define. For what it is worth, she said, echoing Grath's words from a moment before, in 400 years, no one has ever given us a reason to believe this outcome was possible. You have changed that today. I do not know yet what that means for the future, but I suspect it means a great deal more than any of us currently understand. She left the room, and Vexa followed shortly after, murmuring something about filing the initial paperwork before the shift change, leaving Grath and me alone in the quiet, dimly lit space. You should rest, he said, his tone softer than the commanding voice he had used earlier at the checkpoint. Whatever comes next, it will still be waiting for you tomorrow. I nodded, though I doubted rest would come easily, not with everything still churning through my mind, the memory of the moon, the weight of the story I had just told twice in the span of a single hour, the uncertainty of what a new classification might mean for the rest of my life. As Grath rose to leave, he paused at the door, turning back toward me one final time. Can I ask you something? He said, not as a security captain, but simply as someone who has spent his whole life training to protect people from threats he understood how to fight. Of course, I said. If it does come back, he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. If that presence decides to find you again, somewhere down the line, what will you do? I thought about the question longer than I had thought about any of Ilyana's formal inquiries, because this one felt different, less about protocol and more about the honest truth of what I had learned out there on that cold, ancient moon. I think I'll do exactly what I did the first time, I said finally. I'll be terrified. I won't pretend otherwise, because pretending never helped anyone. But I don't think I'll run. I think I'll stand there, and I'll look at it, and I'll ask it what it wants, the same way I did before. Maybe that won't work a second time. Maybe I'll learn there are limits to whatever made it pause the first time. But I'd rather face that uncertainty honestly than spend the rest of my life running from something that might already know exactly where to find me. Grath studied me for a long moment, something like respect settling into his heavy features, before he finally nodded once and stepped out through the door, leaving it to close softly behind him. Alone in that quiet room, I looked down at my own hands again, at the pale scars tracing familiar paths across skin that had long since healed around them. 3 years ago, I had walked into an ancient structure, expecting nothing more than the routine dangers of an unfamiliar landing site. I had walked out carrying a mark that no medical scanner in the galaxy fully understood, a mark that had just turned a routine checkpoint on a crowded station into the beginning of something far larger than I had ever imagined possible. I thought about Liam, about the quiet, careful way he used to double-check every calculation before committing to it, and I hoped, wherever the universe had taken whatever remained of him, that some part of this strange, unfinished story might eventually mean something, might eventually matter in a way that made his loss feel less senseless than it had felt in that first terrible moment. Outside the small room, the station continued its ordinary rhythm, travelers moving through checkpoints, ships arriving and departing, an entire galaxy of routine business continuing on exactly as it had the day before. But somewhere within that ordinary rhythm, a new thread had just been woven into the larger fabric of everything the Coalition believed it understood about the universe. And I understood, with a strange and quiet certainty, that this was only the very beginning of wherever that thread was going to lead. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether coalition researchers would arrive with endless questions, whether some new classification would follow me across every border I ever crossed for the rest of my life, or whether, somewhere out among the stars, something ancient and incomprehensible had already begun paying closer attention than it ever had before. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I sat alone in that quiet room, staring down at scars that had just changed everything. Whatever came next, I would not face it by running. I had already learned, in the worst possible way, exactly what standing still could cost. But I had also learned, in the same terrible moment, exactly what it could save. And that, more than any scar, more than any classification, more than any question a scanner could ever ask, was the truth I intended to carry with me for the rest of my life.